It was a cold winter day in 1992. A young 19-year-old girl pulled down the sleeves on her arms as she walked slowly to the front of the classroom. Her heart was beating out of her chest. Sweat dropped down her back and her armpits. And she was so nervous that her hands began to shake. She approached the gigantic podium, which seemed to swallow her small, tiny stature. And as she placed her speech on the podium, she stood there for what seemed like an eternity. And when she opened her mouth, absolutely nothing came out. Now, I want you to imagine that this is your illustration. In fact, this is easy to imagine because according to Forbes magazine, over 74% of Americans have a fear of public speaking. Do you know what the number 2 fear is? Death. In other words, there are more Americans who would rather die than speak in front of a large crowd. And there is actually a term for this type of fear, and it's called glossophobia. And glossophobia is exactly what was happening to that young girl in that classroom that day. The young girl's 5-minute speech was an absolute disaster. She stumbled over her words and jumbled her words. And as she scanned the room and looked at the faces of her peers, all she could see was pity on their faces. So she stopped mid-sentence, snatched her speech off the podium, and beelined to her seat. She vowed in her mind that she would never come back to this classroom again. All she wanted to do was sink down as low as she could, become invisible, and die. At the end of the class, she was determined to run out as fast as she could because she didn't want to speak to anyone in the class. But her professor motioned her to come over to his desk. But the young girl was so embarrassed that she couldn't even look at her professor's face because she had stopped in the middle of her speech. So she looked down at the floor as she approached his desk. The professor came around the desk. He placed his hand on her shoulder and he said to the young girl, "You can do this." He asked her to come back the next week. And those 4 simple words, "You can do this," was exactly what the young girl needed to hear because her professor was tapping into her greatness within. In the same manner, you can tap into your greatness within and you can overcome your fears. The great Winston Churchill said, "The price of greatness is responsibility." In other words, if you want to be great, if you want to overcome your fears, then it is your responsibility to practice your craft. And that's exactly what the young girl did. She went to her professor for help and she went to her peers and to her roommates. She watched national television shows and speakers and preachers so she could replicate their speaking styles. And she stood in front of her mirror in her room and she practiced breathing and slowing down and enunciating her words. Those 4 simple words was exactly what she needed to get inspired. And she came back that week and the weeks after that. In fact, that young girl went from being one of the worst speakers in the class to being one of the best speakers in the class. Now, I could give you several examples of famous people who started out terrible before they became great. Moses had a speech impediment. He stuttered, and yet God saw his greatness within. And so Moses was able to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. Michael Jordan was cut from his high school varsity basketball team. But because of his work ethic, Michael Jordan is arguably the greatest basketball player of all time. Oprah Winfrey worked for a failed news show, and she was even demoted from her co-anchor position. That is, until she became an international inspiration and success. And Walt Disney was fired for not being creative enough. But yet we've all seen his inspiration because he believed in his greatness within, and we now have Disney theme parks and so many cartoons because of his greatness. And we've all seen President Zelensky, and his critics said that he wouldn't be a great president. But with all the atrocities that are going on in Ukraine, when major leaders, world leaders especially, would leave and run away for their lives, President Zelensky said, "I need ammunition, not a ride." And so I can go on and on and on about so many people who started out terrible and became great. But I just want to remind you, just like the professor did, that you can do this. You can overcome your fears, and you can tap into your greatness within. Now, I must tell you that young girl's story did not end in her classroom. In fact, that young girl became an international speaker, speaking in places like Nashuro, Zimbabwe, and Sabasa, South Africa, speaking at conferences like Q Commons and women's events, business venues and business events, radio shows, podcasts, and Toastmasters. That's right. That young girl joined a Toastmasters group so that she could continue to practice her craft because of those 4 words. You can do this. And those words continue to motivate her to become a better speaker and to work on her craft. That girl in the illustration, that girl is me. I went from never ever wanting to speak in front of a group to becoming an international speaker. In fact, that passion that I had for public speaking allowed me to change my degree. And I graduated from Case Western Reserve University with a degree in communications of all things. But not only that, but I pursued my master's degree and continued to take preaching and speaking classes to hone my speaking skills. And not only did that speaking encourage me from those 4 simple words, but it has funneled to other areas of my life, such as being the leader and president of a nonprofit organization for 10 years, to holding multiple leadership roles in several corporations. And it even emboldened my desire to become an author and write. And I stand before you today as a 4-time published author. In fact, I just released my latest book, The Demise of the American Evangelical, an overview of the history of racism and white supremacy in the church. And I'm excited to say that I've had several speaking engagements about my book, and I can credit that all the way back to my professor and his 4 simple words: you can do this. And I say to you that you can do this, and you can overcome your fears if you tap into your greatness within. And after almost 30 years of speaking and preaching, do you know what? I still get butterflies. In fact, I had them today before I started speaking. And sometimes I get a sense of nausea that comes up, and that has never gone away. And before I step up on stage to speak to thousands, sometimes I feel like I might even pass out. But I'm so glad that those feelings never went away, because it allows for me to not get overconfident. In fact, it forces me to practice. And short of having a panic attack, I'm always nervous. But those first few words, I can get in, and I get in the zone. And now, from becoming someone who was afraid to speak and started out with a bunch of uhs and awkward silence, I now can stand before my audience and command the room. And so when I look back to that younger version of me who was afraid to speak, I'm reminded of those 4 simple words: you can do this. You can overcome your fears, and you can tap into your greatness within. And I'm wondering who you might speak into to this day. Who will you help tap into their greatness within by encouraging them with those 4 simple words? You can do this, and you can overcome your fears if you tap into your greatness within. And in the words of David Villa, I want to remind you, if you want to be great, then you must go beyond the place where those who are not great stop. You can tap into your greatness within, and you can overcome your fears. Because it's not how you start out that counts, but how you finish. God bless you.